Hey everybody, and welcome to the November lecture in the Alberta Aviation Museum 2022 lecture series. I had some technical gremlins on Wednesday when I was doing the lecture live, so I'm just re-recording it today. So if you missed the lecture, you're going to be treated to a slightly better version today. So last month in October, we talked about airlines like Wardair, Gateway Aviation, Pacific Western Airlines, but mainly we were talking about them in the context of being bush operations and flying in northern Canada. So today we're going to follow up on a bunch of those and talk about other major airlines in Canada like Canadian Pacific and Trans-Canada Airlines, and just talk about the growth of major airline industries in Canada, mainly from the end of the Second World War up until the 1980s. And it was a period of pretty rapid growth in the airline industry. So at the end of the Second World War, during the 40s, we had small aircraft like the Lockheed Electra. In the early post-war, a lot of airlines were operating on kind of medium-sized aircraft like the DC-3, and then larger and larger prop liners like the DC-4, DC-6. And then the advent of the jet age really shook things up because it made air travel much, much faster. And then in the 60s, the introduction of the 747, which is the first jumbo jet, again shook things up. The 747 could carry about 480 passengers, which is about 15 to 22 times the size of a single DC-3. So it really allowed airlines to travel long distances, carry a lot more passengers, and then overall bring costs down for travelers. So it really opened up airline travel to a lot of people. Many people today that are younger than, say, 50 probably won't remember the old municipal airport terminal, also known as the administration building. So this is a nice view we have. This would be from the tarmac side, so before you board the aircraft. Of course, there weren't any like jetways in those times, so you'd walk out and board the aircraft from stairs. So this is a view from the tarmac, so on the inside of the airport. And then this is the view from the street. It's a pretty small building, but this is what the municipal had to work with from the 60s until the early 1970s. So it was a pretty big period of expansion for the airport. And of course, in that time is when the international airport opened as well, which was going to have a pretty major consequence and major impact on the municipal airport. This is another view from a little bit later of the outside. So kind of the passenger drop-off area. So you can see it's a pretty small building. So we haven't talked about Trans-Canada Airlines in a while, but before the Second World War, Trans-Canada Airlines primarily used the Lockheed 10 Electra. This here is a photo taken during the inauguration of Trans-Canada Airlines service into Edmonton's municipal airport in 1938. The Model 10 Electra is similar to, say, the Beech 18 and the Barclay Grow. It's just a little bit larger with a capacity for 10 passengers, and it was developed a little bit earlier with its first flight in 1934. And it was really introduced at the perfect time because the United States was amending the Air Commerce Act of 1926, requiring U.S. airlines to use multi-engine aircraft on flights over terrain that wouldn't permit a safe emergency landing or over water. So that really limited a lot of earlier aircraft, single-engine aircraft for carrying passengers. So the Electra was poised to tap into this market quite early on. And the aircraft that followed, like the Beech 18, Barclay Grow to a smaller extent, and other aircraft like the Junior Electra, Super Electra, Lodestar, and whatnot, were much better suited for this time period. This here is a photo I pulled off the internet of a restored Lockheed Electra. It's CFTCC, and it was touring around the country, giving rides for the Dreams Take Flight program. So some of you may have taken a ride on this aircraft when it was Edmonton, about 20 years ago-ish. And this aircraft is currently now on display at the Royal Aviation Museum of Western Canada in Winnipeg. So after the Second World War, Trans-Canada Airlines acquired 26 Douglas C-47s, which is the military version of the DC-3. And they got these aircraft in a pretty convoluted fashion. These particular aircraft were American C-47s, which had been sent to the Royal Air Force through the Lend-Lease program. The Royal Air Force then assigned them to the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan here in Canada. And when the BCATP returned them to the United States, the US decided they didn't want them. So they offered them up for sale to the RAF. The RAF passed on that option to the RCAF, And so then the government of Canada transferred that option to TransCanada Airlines, which of course was a crown corporation. So they're sent to the Canadair plant in Montreal, and Canadair converts them into civilian C-47s, so fitting passenger seats and modifying the aircraft to the DC-3 configuration. So TCA is using these DC-3s. They're also using the 14-passenger Super Electra and the 18-passenger Lodestar. These aircraft were faster than the DC-3, but the DC-3 could carry more people. So the DC-3, generally some are configured for 21 passengers, so 7 rows with 3 seats, and some for 28, so 2x2 seating in 7 rows. This is another photo I stole from the internet of the interior of a TransCanada Airlines DC-3, about 1947. So fairly comfy, but actually quite noisy. But yeah, I mean, decent sized seats, and for a small aircraft, it's fairly roomy. This is a 1944 TransCanada Airlines route map, and you can see at the time that the TransCanada route didn't go through Edmonton. Edmonton was originally not supposed to be on the TransCanada Airlines route. It was added afterwards. So you can see that the TCA route goes through southern Alberta, and it was a feeder route up to Edmonton. So meanwhile, Canadian Pacific Airlines also emerged from the Second World War with similarly new aircraft. So they had 4 Lodestars and 3 DC-3s based here at Blatchford Field. So this is a Canadian Pacific Airlines Lockheed Lodestar, CF-CPE here at Blatchford Field. A lot of these aircraft all kind of look the same from certain angles, unless you count the windows, look at the window shapes, etc. The Lodestar, the Electra, the Barclay Row, they all look pretty similar at first glance. The Lodestar, though, it definitely looks beefier, so it's a bit easier to pick up than the other two. So this is another Canadian Pacific Airlines Lodestar CPA. The rest of CPA's Western fleet included a lot of bush planes. So the Nordine Norseman here, the Fairchild 82, Consolidated Cansos, as well as small airliners like the Barclay Grows. So BLV here is the one that is currently on display at the Aviation Museum, as well as Beech 18s. And then, so they also start using a new livery in the 1940s with this cursive lettering. And you'll see refinements of this livery as we go on. It's a pretty popular livery they used throughout the 50s and 60s. And a lot of people debate as to what is the best livery of a Canadian airline in history. And I think a lot of people would agree that Canadian Pacific kind of takes the cake in the mid-60s. So you'll see refinements of this later on. So this here is a Canadian Pacific DC-3 here at Blatchford Field. So for non-Canadian carriers, Northwest Airlines comes back to Blatchford Field after the war, and this time with the Douglas DC-6 with a capacity for 64 passengers. It's a pretty large aircraft. And they are wanting to forge the trail to Asia. Edmonton is the first of 5 refueling stops on their flight, which goes from Minneapolis to Tokyo. So it's about 1,100 miles from Minneapolis to Edmonton, 1,600 miles from Edmonton to Anchorage, 1,500 miles from Anchorage to Shemiya in the Aleutian Islands, 1,100 miles to Chitose, Japan, 1,120 miles to Manila in the Philippines. Pretty long flight. A weekly service to Tokyo begins in 1947. And the airport is quite busy during this time. We had 74,000 landings and takeoffs. So this is the route. So as I said, from St. Paul or Minneapolis, it's about 1,750 kilometers to Edmonton. From Edmonton to Anchorage is 2,500 kilometers. 2,400 kilometers from Anchorage to Shemiya in the Aleutian Islands. 1,700 kilometers from Shemiya to Tokyo. And 1,800 kilometers from Tokyo to Manila. And although this looks like it's a great service for Edmonton, unfortunately, Edmonton is only a refueling stop on this great voyage to Asia. So although it seemingly puts Edmonton on the map in a big way, because it's only a refueling and servicing stop, passengers aren't actually able to board the aircraft and fly to Asia from Edmonton. Instead, they need to either fly all the way up to Anchorage and catch the aircraft there, or to Minneapolis, St. Paul, and catch it on the beginning of the route. So It doesn't immediately provide a benefit for Edmonton passengers, but it does start to speak to the importance of Edmonton as a launching point for flights to Asia, which is something that Grant McConaughey had really started working on quite heavily before the start of the Second World War. Northwest does suffer several setbacks in their first year. They have an aircraft that's returning from Asia as a military charter. It goes off course in Alaska and hits a mountain in March of 1948. And in October of 1948, DC-4 crashed about 80 kilometers northwest of Edmonton. Unfortunately, it was purely due to pilot error. The pilot had feathered one of the propellers to teach his coworker emergency procedures, and they weren't able to recover the aircraft sufficiently, and it crashed. Meanwhile, speaking of the DC-4, Canadair here in Canada develops the North Star for Trans-Canada Airlines. And this aircraft is kind of a hybrid between the Douglas C-54, which is the military version of the DC-4, the DC-6, but it's fitted with Rolls-Royce engines left over from the Lancaster program. So if you look at this aircraft, it looks very similar to a DC-6. The engines, the nacelles, are round, but the engines inside them are V12s, so not radial engines. And this is a cutaway view of the inside of the North Star. With the Muni so busy, it's very crowded. Canadian Pacific moves its headquarters to Vancouver with a focus on service to the South Pacific. On July 13th, they start their first scheduled flights to Sydney, Australia, through San Francisco, Honolulu, Suva in Fiji, and Auckland, New Zealand. And they're using the Canadian Pacific version of the North Star, called the Canadair 4. And this aircraft was also exported overseas, so this is the British version of the North Star. Some of our volunteers have flown on the North Star. They've described it as extremely noisy, particularly uncomfortable. When you're looking out over the wing, you can see the Merlin engines just belching flames from their exhaust stacks, which is kind of unnerving if you're not used to it. So the North Star was not a particularly popular plane, unfortunately. So this is Canadian Pacific's routes across the Pacific. So leaving from Vancouver to San Francisco, then over to Honolulu in Hawaii, to Tuva in Fiji, Auckland, New Zealand, and up to Sydney, Australia. So if you fly to Australia today, it's a pretty long route, but imagine doing that with an aircraft that only flies about half the speed of a jet. And of course, if you look at this on a flat map, it looks quite different. But if you look at it on a globe, you can see that the route is pretty much a straight line. So it's a great circle route. In April of 1950, United States and Canadian authorities finally grant Northwest permission to pick up passengers here in Edmonton on their Minneapolis to Anchorage run. So this finally opens up that passenger service for Edmonton passengers that want to fly to Asia. Also in 1950, Western Airlines announced a new cross-border service connecting to Edmonton. So they come up to Edmonton in a Convair 340 with an Edmonton to Los Angeles flight that takes 10 hours and 40 minutes long, which sounds like an extremely long flight and much longer than it should take in a Convair 340. But then you realize that this is a real milk run. So on this Edmonton to Los Angeles flight, they have stops in Calgary, Lethbridge, Great Falls, Helena, Butte, West Yellowstone, Idaho Falls, Pocatello, Salt Lake City, and then finally to Los Angeles. So definitely a milk run. Northwest also starts a regular service using a Martin 202, which is a 40-passenger aircraft with twice weekly service between Edmonton and Minneapolis. So that connects Edmonton to various hubs and makes it easier for passengers in Edmonton to connect to various airlines and make it to destinations around the world. So here's a view of that milk run flight. By 1953, about 145 Edmontonians per day were buying tickets, airline tickets. Edmonton's fairly well connected thanks to these connections through Northwest, Western Airlines, Trans-Canada Airlines, Canadian Pacific, etc. It might not be fast, but you can basically get anywhere you want from Edmonton. In that year, Trans-Canada Airlines has 9 flights per day coming through Edmonton, 5 to Calgary, and 2 transcontinental flights in each direction. And by then, Edmonton has now been added to the route, the Trans-Canada route. Western has a daily run to Los Angeles. Northwest has 2 flights a week, Minneapolis to Edmonton return, and then Minneapolis to Asia, collecting passengers, of course, in Edmonton. Canadian Pacific has daily Convair flights to Whitehorse. So things are starting to pick up. And this is a view of the airport in the early 50s, or possibly early 60s. It's hard to date this photo exactly. But you can see the Aviation Museum on the right, and all of the H huts and barracks that were left over from the military base. So on the other side of the Kingsway, where these buildings are today, this is where the Superstore is, the HMCS Nonsuch, which is also a Second World War building, and then this is Tower Road, 116th Street, and the start of the Prince Rupert neighborhood. And this is a little motel, which was called Kingsway Cabins. So here's a 1953 Canadian Pacific Airlines route map through Canada. So you can see, unlike the TCA one that we looked at earlier, I mean, obviously there's a 9-year difference, but Canadian Pacific has a lot more connections throughout Canada, especially northern Canada. And this is because, you know, they haven't entirely focused on only being a major airline and connecting to, you know, larger metropolises or flying overseas. So they have their cross-Pacific service to Asia, but they're also connecting a lot of cities and smaller cities and small towns here in Canada. So it's a pretty extensive network. In 1953, as I mentioned, they had Convair service linking Whitehorse and Fairbanks from Edmonton and Vancouver. And soon, Canadian Pacific Airlines North Stars are supplanted by the DC-6B. So these are the cross-Pacific flights to Asia. Specific Western Airlines, we talked about it last month, mainly in the context of how they started as a bush airline. 1956 is when they take over Associated Airways, and at this time they're mainly concentrating on the DO-line contract. So some charter flights, mainly flying, you know, passengers and supplies in support of the DO-line in northern Canada. So they have small aircraft like the Beaver, somewhat larger aircraft like the York, which they've acquired thanks to their takeover of Associated, as well as other bush planes like the Canso, Curtiss C-46 for carrying passengers. So it's slightly after this they start picking up and becoming more and more interested in becoming a more major airline concentrated on picking up passengers. In the mid-1950s, Trans-Canada Airlines was the first to order the 4-engine turboprop Vickers Viscount airliner. And turboprops, you know, if you look at this aircraft and you don't have a particularly technical knowledge of aircraft and aircraft engines, this doesn't look terribly different than the North Star or the DC-4 or DC-6. But turboprops are actually jet engines that are driving propellers. They're much lighter than internal combustion engines. They have greater performance, so they are able to carry passengers, more passengers, and they're faster, they're more fuel efficient. The Viscount is a very nice airliner. It's got huge windows, so great views from the cabin. And first they bring this Viscount to Edmonton on a promo tour, but pretty soon they are operating 51 Viscounts across Canada. In 1956, they also bring the Lockheed Super Constellation to Edmonton. And this aircraft totally stretches the limits of the municipal airport. It can only land at night when the air is cooler in order to take off from the, and also take off at night. Edmonton's municipal airport is just under 6,000 feet long, and our altitude is 2,200 feet. So it's very marginal to fly this aircraft out of the municipal airport. If you read the newspaper articles at the time, they all described the like horrendous roar from this aircraft at night as it was taking off and landing from the municipal airport. So it wasn't particularly popular for non-aviation enthusiasts when it was coming to and from Edmonton. The Super Constellation was developed by Lockheed during the war as a wartime troop transport. And, you know, as you can see, it's a huge aircraft. So this picture is in front of the TCA hangar here in Edmonton at Blatchford Field, with, of course, children just running around in the middle of the airport. So the tail there is about 50 feet wide, and the wingspan is 123 feet, and the fuselage is 114 feet long. So That's a big aircraft, bigger than a 737. It's powered by four 18-cylinder Wright Cyclone 3350 radial engines, each developing 3,000 horsepower. So you can imagine why it's so loud. And this aircraft carries about 62 to 82 passengers, depending on its configuration. This particular photo is pretty bad, but it is a color photo of a TCA Constellation taking off from Blatchford Field. And we don't have actually very many photos of the TCA Constellation. This is a rare time that it was flying it during the daytime. And this is an advertisement from the Edmonton Journal from 1956, advertising Trans-Canada Airlines service. So you can see that they've also expanded their routes significantly. And their fleet at this time is the Constellation, there are more than 50 Viscounts, the North Star, and the DC-3. And they soon start changing their operations to eliminate more and more of these smaller aircraft and focus on larger and larger airlines. So the Douglas DC-8 is the next aircraft to be introduced by Trans-Canada Airlines. And unfortunately for Edmonton, it is too large for the municipal airport. The municipal airport has nowhere to go, nowhere to expand to. It's hit its limits. The north end of the airport is the Calder Yards, the rail yards. The south end is Kingsway. So there's just physically no more room to build the runways longer to accommodate these jet aircraft. Thankfully for Edmonton, the Department of Transport has already announced by this time that a new airport is going to be built south of the city. And of course, this is the International Airport. So in 1955, land near Leduc was set aside as the future site of the Edmonton International Airport. So Transport Canada purchased about 7,600 acres of land for about $1.5 million. And there was an unwritten agreement at the time that the original landowners were allowed to lease back and continue to farming the land until the land was actually needed for the airport as they expanded. Turning 7,600 acres of farmland into an international airport is not particularly easy. Weeds totally overtook the construction area, and because they churned up the land, weeds moved in and they spread into surrounding farmland, which really annoyed everybody around the airport. There was a colony of beavers that moved in and kept building dams and flooding the site, which was also particularly annoying. And airport security was having to deal with a lot of keeping livestock off the runways in the early years of the International Airport. This photo, of course, is from a little bit later. The terminal building that we know today wasn't actually built when the airport opened. Its first terminal in 1960, when it opened, was an arch hangar, which is still in use today at the north end of the airport. And the passenger terminal that we know now today was built in the international style in 1963. Well, sorry, it opened in 1963. So currently this is the north terminal at the International Airport. And so when the International was built, it was initially decided that the municipal airport would close. Basically, everything would be moving to the International Airport once the passenger terminal opened, and so everything would be consolidated at the International Airport. However, by the time they started opening the International, they started re-examining this issue. They hired some consultants, and they realized that there was a growing development of regional airliners in Canada, and that regional airline service really used the city center airport, especially with service to Calgary. So the city of Edmonton then decided to keep both airports open and operate both airports. And this is a pretty complicated subject, and we're going to revisit it in the December lecture on December 28th. So I'm just going to talk about it a little bit today, but mainly that'll be the focus of the December lecture. This is an early photo of the inside of the terminal building. So very, very 60s. At the time, the federal Liberals lose control over the federal government after about 22 years of power in 1957. So this also put C.D. Howe out of power, who was, of course, he was responsible for creating Trans-Canada Airlines and really oversaw airline development in Canada. So with this change of government comes an opportunity for private airlines like Canadian Pacific to expand, because the government has less control over this monopoly of air routes in Canada. So Canadian Pacific applies to the Air Transport Board for 3 flights daily: Vancouver, Calgary, Winnipeg, Toronto, Montreal, paralleling the railroad. The Canadian Pacific Railroad, of course, is owned by, the Canadian Pacific owns Canadian Pacific Railroad and Canadian Pacific Airlines. So at the same time, Russ Baker of Pacific Western Airlines is also working on an application for a Vancouver to Montreal route, and he's wanting to buy the 60-passenger de Havilland Comet. The two of them strike a deal. If Pacific Western Airlines retracts its application and Canadian Pacific Airlines is successful, then Canadian Pacific will turn over their bush operation routes down the Mackenzie River to Pacific Western Airlines. Because Canadian Pacific at the time is really wanting to get rid of those bush routes and transition into a major airline, and Pacific Western Airlines is already operating on a lot of those routes and providing a lot of service to Northern Canada. So it's a mutually beneficial decision for them. The Air Transport Board comes back and gives McConaughey and CPA only one flight per day, but it's enough to strike a deal. Pacific Western Airlines gets the northern routes, and it also gets the prairies, because TransCanada Airlines opts to stop the smaller prairie routes like Saskatoon, Prince Albert, North Battleford, Regina, Medicine Hat, Lethbridge. TCA is losing about $25,000 a year on the service, and they want to dump their small DC-3s and upgrade to larger and larger aircraft. PWA takes over these routes, but unfortunately they don't actually do any better. The routes are not particularly profitable. Russ Baker, the founder of Pacific Western Airlines, sadly dies of a heart attack in November of 1958. So before he was really able to realize his dream of transitioning PWA into a huge major airline, but his enthusiasm really continues on with the company, and his successors are able to carry that momentum forward. So a year later, in 1959, Pacific Western Airlines was part of the largest single transfer of scheduled services in Canadian aviation history. So Canadian Pacific released licensed routes from Edmonton to 18 points in northern Alberta and the Northwest Territories to Pacific Western Airlines. So in addition to its existing routes, Pacific Western Airlines was now licensed to provide scheduled air services over about 7,000 miles throughout Western and Northern Canada. And this allows Pacific Western Airlines to transition from a bush operation into a regularly scheduled airline. Once the international opens, as I mentioned, pretty much all the passenger carriers move over to the international airport, except for Pacific Western, who are the only major outfit to stay at the Muni, in addition to smaller outfits like Eldorado, Gateway, etc. So this allows TransCanada Airlines to bring their Douglas DC-8 four-engine jet airliner, which carries 128 passengers. Flights from Edmonton International direct to Vancouver take about 90 minutes. You can get to Toronto in about 4 hours, and this service begins in April of 1961. So it really, kind of starts the modern jet age. In 1960, Canadian Pacific Airlines was operating nonstop flights to Amsterdam with the Bristol Britannia turboprop aircraft several times a week from the International. And by 1961, Canadian Pacific had also brought in the Douglas DC-8, and they were operating nonstop service to Amsterdam from Edmonton. Northwest Airlines, the American carrier, was operating daily flights on the DC-7 propliner from Edmonton to Winnipeg to Minneapolis and on to New York City to Idlewild Airport, which is now JFK Airport. And of course, from JFK, you can get anywhere. You can connect with Pan Am, and it's a great service for Edmontonians. In 1958, Canadian Pacific launched their service to Europe from Edmonton on their DC-6B Empress of Edmonton propliner from the municipal airport via the Pole. Reporters wrote at the time that this 64-passenger aircraft would have only one stop in Greenland, which is unfortunately a lie. It's actually impossible to basically take off in a DC-6 with enough gas from the municipal airport to fly to Greenland nonstop. So they take off, they land it in Nemeo, which is a much, much larger runway of, I can't remember exactly, say 12,000 feet. Fully fuel the aircraft, they take off from Nemeo, fly to Greenland, and then over to Amsterdam. So it takes about 16 hours to get to Amsterdam. But soon enough, they bring in the Bristol Britannia, and they're doing this route from the International Airport, and it cuts the trip down to 11 hours. So it's a pretty short service. As I mentioned earlier, Canadian Pacific Airlines modifies or adapts their livery in this time. They still have this cursive writing, and I really love this goose logo. And the goose, of course, dates back to Western Canada Airways and Canadian Airways, so James Richardson's companies. But yeah, they have this really stylized modern goose logo on the back of their aircraft in the 60s. And I think that's my favorite. And it's a little bit off topic, but Canadian Airways, which of course takes over much later Canadian Pacific Airlines, they reintroduced this goose logo in 1999 as their final livery before they're bought out by Air Canada. Anyways, as part of the agreement to build the International, Edmonton maintains the municipal airport as a feeder airport. So because of this, they rebrand the airport as the Edmonton Industrial Airport, since the passenger service is really scheduled, goes to the International, and the municipal is really for those rugged operators, servicing Northern Canada, doing charter flights, bringing freight and whatnot. So it's basically a branding decision to rename it as the Industrial Airport. And there's a similar pattern. This is not just exclusive to Edmonton. A lot of airports around the world, especially a lot in the United States, are undergoing the same change as smaller, city-bound airports are replaced by larger and larger airports, and sometimes retained for similar reasons as the Muni. So in the early 60s, some airline executives are really eager to tap into a new market. There's a lot more potential vacationers than there were in, obviously, the 40s during the war and the 50s. So the DC-8 can fly to Hawaii for $340, which was expensive, but significantly cheaper than it had been before. So it really makes, these large aircraft that can make the trip quickly and carry a lot of passengers start making these trips more economical and more practical for more vacationers. There's a lot of war brides that are wanting to go back to Europe and visit their ancestral homes. Immigrants to Canada that want to, bring their families back and introduce them to their former countries. Or there's just a lot of people that want to go exploring. They've heard about Hawaii and they want to go to the beach, and who can blame them? So Edmontonians Grant McConaughey and Max Ward are both very eager to tap into this market. Wardair at the time is mainly a bush operation. They're flying beavers, otters, and a Bristol freighter out of Yellowknife. And so Max Ward reforms Wardair as Wardair Canada Limited, with its headquarters here in Edmonton. And at the time, there's a regulatory loophole that makes his idea possible, which is called the Affinity Charter. So the government controls who gets regularly scheduled routes across Canada. So that's why there's always this battle between the government-owned TransCanada Airways and other airliners. But you are allowed to operate as a charter service. But, of course, it's difficult to find a group that would want to charter like an 80-passenger aircraft, for instance. So what he does is he comes up with this idea, doesn't necessarily come up with it by himself, but adapts this idea of the Affinity Charter. And it's essentially a group or club that forms to charter these aircraft and can fly to Europe or to Hawaii. So that club can be any kind of club as long as the members pay a fee and are members for 6 months. So they lease an 88-passenger DC-6 from Canadian Pacific in 1962, and it's essentially chartered by the I Want to Go on Vacation in Scandinavia Club. They fly to Copenhagen in 21 hours, stopping in Frobisher and Prestwick, and leaving from the International Airport. The DC-6 makes, I think, 8 trips in 1962. It doesn't really earn Wardair any money, but Max Ward learns from the experience, and he's convinced that this idea has merit. So for Wardair, he buys a used DC-6 from KLM for $300,000, and then launches this charter service. So a lot of these groups are groups of, say, people with Dutch ancestry here in Edmonton, or Scots ancestry, or Irish ancestry, and they're wanting to go back and visit those countries. But other clubs are like a Mountaineers Club or canoe clubs. This is the Edmonton Co-op. So essentially, they're just effectively nonsense clubs that are formed in order to get past these regulatory rules and form groups so that they can charter these aircraft and fly on vacation. So this is the Advantage Through Concorde Club, which is an Amsterdam flight that Wardair launched in 1965. And of course, you can't just go and advertise in the paper that we're going to make this nonsense club and fly to Europe. So advertising was kind of through word of mouth. And so it was definitely tricky. You had to kind of wink, wink, nudge, nudge, operate like this. It was kind of an open secret, but you couldn't just blatantly violate the rules and advertise it as a regular scheduled service. But, you could advertise for these groups and through word of mouth get people interested in these charter companies. So here's the Caledonian Society of Alberta flying to Scotland. And Wardair, because of this affinity charter model, they were actually able to operate a lot cheaper than the regularly scheduled airlines. So Wardair, for most of its life, was a very, very affordable airline, essentially like a discount airline, but it wasn't providing discount airline service. The service on Wardair aircraft were known for extremely high quality meals, very friendly, very professional staff, and their steak and champagne flights was a really popular advertising campaign in the 1980s. So it was really, really high quality service that Max Wardair was providing on these aircraft. In 1962, TransCanada Airlines operated direct flights to London's Heathrow Airport once a week with a stop in Winnipeg. And also are flying to Paris 3 times a week with stops in Montreal and Montreal with these DC-8s. So service starts picking up and more routes get added from Edmonton's International Airport. Meanwhile, at the municipal, though, Pacific Western Airlines is starting to grow their business, and they introduce a pretty radical new concept in 1963. It's a big change for the company. So as I said, they've mainly been focused on northern operations. And some small feeder routes, but they see this growing need for a fast and really convenient service between Edmonton and Calgary. Often these Edmonton to Calgary or Calgary to Edmonton passengers have very little baggage. They're often typically business passengers. They might fly, they might only want to go for the day. But they'll always feel that, the ticketing requirements, the reservations, picking up your ticket in advance, checking in advance, dropping your baggage off is just kind of a pain for a simple flight to Edmonton to Calgary. It's a lot easier to just go to the bus station, jump on the bus, and go to Calgary. So they say, you know what, why don't we just operate an aircraft like a bus? So this radical concept is essentially that. You get to show up at the airport, you get on board the aircraft, buy a ticket, and leave. You don't have to buy a ticket in advance. You don't have to check your bags. It's super, super convenient. So Canadian Pacific Airlines doesn't object to this. So PWA applies to the Air Transport Board. CPA doesn't think this is going to work. TransCanada Airlines doesn't care as long as they keep operating from the international airport. So PWA repurposes a DC-4 freighter, converts it to carrying passengers. They send it to Vancouver, and it's done up in a First Nations theme with a Vancouver-based design firm in charge. And of course, if they did this today, they would know the intent was to honor Western Indigenous heritage. Of course, if they did this today, they would want to hire an actual Indigenous person to do up the aircraft. So it's a 66-passenger aircraft. Its interior is bedecked in Haida bear motifs. The bulkheads feature large carved wooden heads. And they launch it as the Chieftain Airbus service. The first flight is just with invited guests. The real test is to see who's going to pay $11 for the ticket. The first actual flight gets 46 passengers in the 66 aircraft. And it works. It operates literally like a bus. So they arrive, get on the plane, buy a ticket, and leave. No reservations, no checked baggage, no advanced ticketing, nothing. And this is Tommy Fox cutting the ribbon for the first Chieftain Airbus flight here out of Edmonton. Tommy Fox, of course, had started Associated Airways, and when Pacific Western took over, he became the vice president of PWA. Also in the 60s is basically the advent of the jet age in Edmonton. In 1966, Wardair leased a new Boeing 727 narrow-body jet for a 10-year lease period. It's flown into the International Airport from Seattle and named Cy Becker, who had recently passed away. And Cy Becker, of course, was a World War I ace and lawyer and prosecutor. He started Commercial Airways with Wap May and was a very popular prosecutor here in Edmonton. Cy Becker's wife is on hand to christen this aircraft, and she attempts to smash a champagne bottle on the nose of the aircraft. It doesn't break and ends up putting a very large dent in the nose of the $5 million aircraft, which is a bit of an oops. The 727 can carry 120 passengers nonstop to London, and it makes 104 trips in the summer of 1966. The DC-6 only makes 18, so clearly the jets are the way of the future. They're much faster, and passengers are starting to demand better and better service. Wardair is growing significantly. So from only 712 passengers in 1962, they're now up to 12,407 passengers in 1966. A couple years before this, in 1964, it also marked the introduction of another unique service known as the Inclusive Tour Charter Program from Wardair. So this is another first for Canada, with flights from Vancouver to the Grand Cayman Islands, all-inclusive flights. Later that same year, Canadian Pacific started operating group charters across the Atlantic, mainly to the United Kingdom. And yeah, the 727 has a pretty fun registration. So here it is actually at the municipal airport. So it's registered at CF Fun. So see, these are a few of the brochures from Wardair from the mid-1960s. So advertising, or not advertising, but basically a flyer inviting Knights of Columbus members on this charter flight. And a few of the newspaper articles from the day. 727 is immediately popular, and it really shows Wardair that the jet age is the way of the future. So shortly after that, they added their first Boeing 707, which allowed nonstop intercontinental flights to Europe starting in 1968. 707 very similar to TransCanada Airways DC-8. So here's a comparison shot. The further of the two aircraft are the 707, and the closer aircraft is the 727. So somewhat similar sizes. Jumping back to Pacific Western Airlines, they add the Boeing 707 to their fleet in 1967. With it, they launch all-inclusive tour packages to Mexico and Hawaii in the winter months and European destinations in the summertime. And these are all operated as charters. They also use the cargo variant of the Boeing 707, which is meant to haul livestock and perishable goods over very long range. So they have this passenger service, and they also launched the cargo service. And PWA basically became synonymous with world air cargo. So their aircraft visited more than 90 countries during this period of time and transported a huge variety of goods around the world. In 1967, PWA became the first commercial operator of the Lockheed C-130 Hercules, or the L-100 Hercules, as it's known as a civilian model. This is a large turboprop freighter that can carry large, heavy loads and operate from really marginal areas. Absolutely fantastic aircraft. So during the winter months, PWA Hercs would fly into northern Canada, bringing large, heavy equipment for mining, oil and gas operations into the Arctic. And of course, the tundra was frozen in the wintertime, so it allowed these very large, very heavy aircraft to operate from relatively marginal fields. After the ice melted in the spring, the PWA would send their Hercs on charter flights all around the world, so carrying basically everything you could imagine that would fit in a Herc. One flight was 21,000 kilograms of dimes. One was 20,000 kilograms of Christmas cake. And even one flight, they shipped electronics to China, which was the first commercial air shipment to that country. And that kind of sounds bizarre in 2022, shipping electronics to China, but things have changed in the last 60 years. So PWA eventually expands its Herc fleet up to 6 aircraft. And their Herc operations were actually operated from the top of the Edmonton Inn. at the municipal airport. PWA also launched the Stampeder service linking Alberta and BC in December of 1968. And this one featured a PWA Western outfit that was designed by their employees. So this is a service linking Vancouver, Kamloops, and Calgary. And with the Stampeder service comes the use of the Boeing 737. And in 1969, PWA brings the 737 to Edmonton for the Airbus service. So this massively cuts down on the time that it takes to get to Calgary. It's a 30-minute hop to Calgary, which is so short that they don't actually have time to sell tickets on board the aircraft any longer. So you have to buy your ticket ahead of time before getting on the plane. But it's still a very successful service. They also operate other 737s. They're combination passenger freight combi aircraft, mainly serving the north, massively cutting down on travel time to the north and really establishing a really strong connection for northern cities in Canada. With the airport so busy, the industrial airport institutes a $3 user fee per passenger, which raises $300,000 for the airport in 1968. So this is the freighter passenger combi aircraft. In April of 1971, the Airbus had their 1 millionth passenger. This is Mickey Doherty. So he's somewhat surprised to be met by the mayor and PWA officials, and he's celebrated upon arrival as the 1 millionth passenger here at the airport. Other service into Edmonton. In 1966, Stubb Ross started up Lethbridge Air Service in 1966 as a feeder airline. So connecting Lethbridge, Calgary, and Medicine Hat in southern Alberta, mainly feeding people to the Calgary airport. And their first aircraft was a Beech 18, or Expediter, ex-RCAF Expediter. And this particular aircraft is now on display here at the Alberta Aviation Museum. So from this single Beech, he expands service north, first to Red Deer, and then to the industrial airport. And then he changes the name to Time Air. So in 1969, Time Air arrives at the International Airport with the Beech 18. They rapidly expand to include 2 de Havilland Twin Otters and a 36-passenger Fairchild 27. Later aircraft include the 30-passenger short SD-30 or short 330, and we'll revisit Time Air a little bit later. So here's a view of the International Airport Terminal, the Industrial Airport Terminal, formerly known as the Municipal Airport Terminal. Because of all this increased activity at the industrial airport, it's starting to upset the Department of Transport, and they don't want people passing up on the international. So pressure starts really building to close the downtown industrial airport and move everything to the international. But there's a huge pushback from Edmontonians and people that really value the municipal airport. But the municipal or industrial airport doesn't have proper facilities at the time. They don't have proper air traffic control. So the Department of Transport tells the city that if they want to keep the Muni open as is, they need to add proper air traffic control. So they build a new tower, which is the one that stands today. And this tower opens in 1972. It's 100 feet tall, which gives them a much better view of the airfield than the tower before, which was mounted on top of the terminal building. They're also worried about the mix of aircraft at the field. So you've got everything from Fleet Canucks at the Flying Club, which are small single-engine trainer aircraft, to large Boeing 737s that Pacific Western Airlines is operating. So these are photos of the tower when it was first opened in 1972. And of course, if you look at the tower today, it's white or grayish with orange stripes. But for most of its life, the tower was actually painted this kind of light bluey turquoise color. So this is a view looking south from the north end of the airport, and a view looking the opposite direction from the inside of the terminal, inside of the tower. You can see that it's actually a pretty small area on the inside. And of course, a view today of the same tower amidst the Blatchford development. Pacific Western Airlines, as I said, also had a cargo version of the 707. And PWA Flight 3801 was a flight that landed in Toronto on the 31st of December 1972, having previously visited Athens in Greece, Tenerife, the Canary Islands, Santa Maria in the Azores, and Moncton in New Brunswick. Poor weather in Moncton delayed the aircraft, so it didn't arrive in Toronto for a full 24 hours later than it was supposed to, which really complicated this crew scheduling for Pacific Western Airlines. So they flew in a new crew from Vancouver to take over. That crew arrived in the early morning of January 1st, 1973. And they had a cargo of 86 cattle bound for Seoul, South Korea. So they're loaded into cattle bins aboard the aircraft, and they make preparations to fly to Edmonton for a refueling stop before flying on to Seoul. So 3801 departs at basically just after midnight for an estimated 3 hour and 45-minute flight to Edmonton. On board are Captain Arthur Jung, who's 51, of Vancouver, First Officer Lowell Dirksen, who's 27, of Surrey, BC, Chief Engineer George Dormer, who's 45, from Richmond. The loadmaster is Keith McMahon, he's 30, from Delta, BC, and PWA Project Manager Bill Vance, who's 35, and he's from Edmonton. The crew reported no issues through the flight. They contacted Edmonton Center Air Traffic Control at about 1:10 in the morning Edmonton time over Reflex Lake, which is the Alberta-Saskatchewan border, to report that they'd be arriving in about 30 minutes. The weather report they received painted a pretty grim picture of the international airport. It was an obscured ceiling of 800 feet with 3/4 mile visibility and light blowing snow, and wind blowing from the west at 30 knots, gusting to 40. Pretty miserable blizzardy conditions. By about 1:30 in the morning, PWA 3801 was 12 miles from the airport and cleared for a straight-in, back-course ILS approach to runway 29. Edmonton Center passed them on to Edmonton Tower. 3801 acknowledged the handoff. And against proper procedures, nearly 3 minutes passed without further communication from the aircraft. So Tower contacted 3801 to ask, 3801 International, how do you read? The captain responded that they were coming up on the back marker, so the tower cleared them to land. And the final ATC communication was as followed. So 3801, I have the strobes on, advise you if you want them off. The captain said, Roger. They advised 3801 regarding the braking action conditions at the airport, as far as the icing conditions on the runway, but the transmission wasn't acknowledged. A few seconds later, they radioed 3801 to say that they had a power failure. And over the next 2 minutes, the tower tried to contact 3801 and received no response. So crash findings concluded that the aircraft entered trees on the north shore of Telford Lake with the wings pretty much level, 50 meters to the right of the intended center line of the runway 29 approach, but more than 3 kilometers short of the runway at an angle of about 18 degrees to the right of the runway. The airport's power failure was caused by the high-frequency shortwave antenna on the vertical stabilizer breaking the transmission lines at the crash site, which provides an estimated time for the crash. Post-impact fire engulfed the aircraft and destroyed a very large portion of the remains. And so while this aircraft, CFPWZ, was equipped with a flight data recorder, the accident investigators determined that about 22 days before the crash, the foil had become stuck across the platen of the recording assembly, and then repeated motions of the stylus across it cut through the foil, and there was very little usable information on the flight data recorder. The only thing that it had was really the position of the heading stylus, which indicated a final magnetic heading of 303 to 304 degrees. They also had a cockpit voice recorder installed, but heat from the fire irreparably damaged it, and they weren't able to recover any information from the cockpit voice recorder. So because of that, investigators weren't really able to conclusively determine a cause for the crash, but there was a number of factors that probably contributed to the outcome. Captain Jung was an experienced airline pilot. He had about 18,680 hours, and since June 1970, he had been flying the 707 and acquired 2,552 hours on the 707-100, so a shortened version of the aircraft, and then switched to the 300 series on the 15th of September 1972 and had 350 hours on this version. He was PWA's most experienced pilot, And so as that, he operated as the training officer for the 707. In the weeks prior to the crash, he'd been suffering from a lot of stress, mainly due to flying a lot of irregular hours on checkout flights with first officers, and still teaching ground school during the day. And prior to the crash, he'd been awake for about 20 hours, which is considered a pretty significant factor towards the crash. First officer had a total of 28 hours of flying time at the time of the crash, including 1,200 hours on the 737, but had only recently been promoted to the 707 in September of 1972, and he'd only completed a single landing on the 707-300 during his training. For 6 weeks prior to the crash, so from the 15th of November 72 until the flight left Toronto on December 31st, he'd been on vacation and he hadn't flown at all. 3801 was meant to be his final checkout ride on the 707. The investigators were able to determine that there was no evidence that the cattle pens came loose or contributed to the accident. The engines were running at 90% power when it crashed, and they didn't find any issue. They did find that the positions of the electrical switches indicated that there was an interruption of essential power during the flight at some point, but analysis of the generators indicated the generators were providing sufficient power. Both altimeters indicated a static pressure buildup, so both were reading lower than field elevation when examined, so they thought they were higher than they were. Sorry, they thought they were... Yes. And then microscopic scratches on the airspeed indicator from the needle indicated that they were flying about 140 to 149 knots at impact. So, mainly, you know, a lot of pilot error. There's this weird electrical gremlin. And then it's equipped with a different model of flight director system than most of the crew was used to. And different than the one that was installed on the smaller 707 and the 737. And the glide slope indicator on this other model is uncovered during a back course ILS approach, which makes it possible for the pilots to get false glide slope indications. So it makes it seem like they're on the proper glide slope when they're really not. So while an exact cause for the crash won't ever be known, there are basically a multitude of errors caused the crash, including like terrible conditions, improper crew procedures. The first officer was flying the plane, but had only one landing on the 707. He hadn't flown at all in the previous 6 weeks. Visible was terrible, freezing conditions, low ceiling, and probably as the first officer was approaching the airport, he extended the landing gear, extended full flaps, but something distracted the crew. So they analyzed the voice recordings that were recorded at the International Airport, and they could tell from the engine power, the sounds of the engines on that transmission, that the engines were still operating at only about 84% power. And the average ground speed between this position until impact was only about 90 knots. So they were significantly slower than they probably should have been. During this approach, they probably had an electrical issue during the final stages of flight, and so the captain was probably distracted trying to figure out that electrical issue while the first officer was trying to land the plane. And in zero visibility and probably with an unfamiliar glide slope on the instruments, they essentially just flew it into the trees and into the ground. This is the worst accident in the Edmonton International Airport's history. So all 5 crew and, of course, all of the cattle on board were killed. Thankfully, in the 50 years since, there hasn't been a worse accident at the International Airport. These are some of the views from the crash scene. In 2018, the city of Leduc called the museum to come and help recover artifacts that were still left that hadn't been cleaned up during the 1973 crash investigation. So they're turning this area into the Telford recreational lands. So the museum came in and mapped out a wide variety of debris, Souvenir hunters over the years have obviously disturbed a lot of things. Some people have removed stuff from the site. Others have actually piled things up to make the debris easier to find. So we mapped out the remains that we were able to recover in 2018. This is essentially a heat map of the densities of clusters of artifacts that we found. And this is superimposed over a diagram of the crash investigation from 1973. So, no surprise, all of the debris is on the flight path. This is a basically plan view of the 707-300 superimposed over the crash site. So it really shows how large this debris field extends compared to the original size of the aircraft. So it was flying in at a very shallow angle. Sites A, B, and I is where we found a lot of the leading edge flaps. So on the front of the wing, the wings come down, the flaps come down and are hanging below the wing. So as it started coming in and hitting these trees, those leading edge flaps would have been ripped off the wings, which would have definitely killed the lift, obviously slowed the aircraft down as well as it's starting to hit trees. And then as it crashes through the trees at a shallow angle, more and more pieces break off the aircraft. And then the main debris field was to the north of this. Most of the artifacts that we recovered couldn't really be identified with certainty due to lack of diagnostic features, although some of them contained original Boeing part numbers, either painted or stamped on, or cast within the part. So, some of them are very identifiable as parts of the leading edge flaps, while others are just, fragmented parts of sheet metal. So, going back in time a couple of years, 1969 saw the introduction of the Boeing 747. This aircraft was developed from a request by Pan American Airways for a jet that was about 2.5 times the size of the first Boeing 707. Generally, they wanted this so they could carry significantly more passengers at less cost. The 747 was the first twin-aisle wide-body airliner. And in 1973, Max Ward ordered the 747. The jumbo jet has a seating capacity of 455 passengers, so absolutely massive leap forward compared to the previous jets that they had. And this purchase really shocked the Canadian airline industry. And it's often hard to tell how big a lot of jet aircraft are. They kind of all look the same. So if you see one by itself, it's hard to tell how big it is. I really like this picture because it's got the 737, the 707, and the 707 all in one picture. So it really shows just how insanely large the 747 is compared to these other two aircraft. The fourth aircraft in the picture, the one with the silver wings and red wingtips, is the de Havilland 83 Foxmoth. And this was the type of aircraft that Max Ward first got started with Polaris. So Wardair purchased a second 747 a year later, and then ended up selling off the 727. Got two more 747s, and then we're mainly flying a mixed fleet of 707s and 747s for the remainder of the 1970s. And this was the year that affinity charters were finally abolished, and Wardair was freer to operate their charters, so they created a new company called International Vacations, or Intervac, to facilitate Canadian holidays, reservations, and all-inclusive trips. So finally they could advertise much more free and attract a lot more passengers and get word of mouth, not operate solely on word of mouth, but operate properly and advertise. So these are some of the advertisements from the mid-70s. CP Air then introduced the 747 on nonstop service to Amsterdam from Edmonton with 2 flights a week beginning in 1976. By 78, the CP was also operating a nonstop 747 service to Honolulu. Air Canada had also begun 727 service here in Edmonton with both flights to Los Angeles and San Francisco by 1979. And although initially centered on Edmonton, a lot of long-haul flights were relocated to concentrate on Vancouver and Toronto as primary destinations. So while Edmonton would continue to connect Edmonton to major Canadian cities, and it did also operate as a transatlantic hub for Wardair. So we still had flights from Edmonton to Prestwick, London Gatwick, Amsterdam, Frankfurt, and Honolulu. And Hawaii really became a significant winter destination. Gatwick was becoming the major summertime destinations. Gatwick also connected to Vancouver, Calgary, Winnipeg, Ottawa, and Toronto. A lot of Canadians were flying Wardair, of course, but a lot of British people were coming to Canada on Wardair. So when you talk to Canadians, there's a lot of people that have really fond memories of Wardair and flying on Wardair and great things to say about their service. Same thing for the UK. If you talk to a lot of people in the UK, they have really good things to say because they were flying from the UK to Canada on Wardair. So this is a kind of a candid shot, but it's showing the route map on a Wardair flight. And as I mentioned earlier, Wardair was becoming fast recognized within the world aviation industry and with passengers, travel agents as being an absolutely superlative carrier. Their in-flight service ranked with the first-class service offered on some of the scheduled carriers. And this, as I said, this high-class service was implemented right from the start. Passengers sat in seats that were custom designed for Wardair, which was pretty unusual for a chartered carrier. Max Board really demanded the absolute best in terms of cuisine, presentation, and professionalism. So passengers were served meals like filet mignon, which was cooked to order on board, served on Royal Dalton China. Drinks were never served from a trolley. They were served by hand on silver trays covered in white linen. The cabin crew on board were, would carry babies around to calm them during the flight. There was fresh fruit available on board, so it was by far the best service in Canada. And there's pretty much nobody that I've heard that has ever said anything bad about a Wardair flight, with the possible exception of some of the flight attendants that actually worked for Wardair. And it's not just exclusive to Wardair, but during the 60s and 70s, it was a really important transition period for crews on board aircraft. At the time, they were expected to work extremely long hours. If there was a layover, the flight attendants were expected to entertain the crew in the airport lounge, and they weren't paid for that. They were only paid for the time that they were on board the aircraft with the doors closed. So through the 70s, there was a lot of strikes, not only with Wardair. They wanted the right to refuse to work longer than 16 hours when flights were delayed and make sure the company had plans in place to bring in extra crew. And through a lot of strikes and a lot of fights and a lot of hard work by a lot of these women, they were able to actually secure a lot of the rights that modern flight attendants and cabin crew are able to enjoy today. But it was a pretty long and brutal fight. Also in the mid-70s, there was a company called White Pass and Yukon Corp, which is controlled by Federal Industries Limited of Winnipeg. And they announced that they would be putting in an offer for 60% of Pacific Western Airlines' outstanding shares. PWA board is reluctant. They're reluctant to sell a controlling interest, but they will entertain an offer to buy all of it. So if somebody wants to completely buy them out, they will entertain that offer. Federal Industries was initially Federal Grain, but by 1972, they'd sold their grain assets to become Federal Industries. They were expanding mainly as a management company. They had their hands in a whole bunch of different industries, like trucking companies, bookstores, railroads, aircraft parts, metals, etc. There were also rumors at the time that Dave Barrett, who is the Premier of British Columbia, had designs on purchasing PWA. PWA was headquartered in Vancouver, but it earned most of its profit and revenue in Alberta. So there was talks that he was going to essentially nationalize or provincialize PWA, which set off a lot of alarm bells. Dave Barrett, of course, was an NDP Premier of BC, and so a lot of conservatives, small c conservatives, were freaking out about nationalizing a really successful private airline like PWA. So what happens instead? In 1974, the government of Alberta, under Progressive Conservative Premier Peter Lougheed, assumed ownership of Pacific Western Airlines. They did that mainly to ensure that PWA would continue on its development of North and Western Canada. So they bought the airline for $37.5 million, which, if you do the math, is about equivalent to $196 million today. And it was this relatively secret takeover bid. And it's kind of ironic that there was so much backlash against the NDP idea of doing this that the Alberta Conservatives essentially took the idea, did the same thing, but made it a made in Alberta solution. So there was a lot of newspaper articles at the time criticizing them. A lot of conservatives criticizing the Conservative government. So it's a pretty interesting time if you go back and read these opinion pieces in the journal. In 1975, they started operating a Vancouver to Seattle flight, taking it over from Air Canada. And in 1976, they started a Toronto to Vancouver and Toronto to Calgary charter for $200 and Toronto to Halifax. So it started giving PWA a wider Canadian presence. In 1977, they bought Transair and merged Transair's aircraft into their fleet. They did operate it as a separate entity for the last couple of years. And in 1978, PWA suffered their only loss of passengers during a crash. It was a Boeing 737 that crashed at Cranbrook. It's wintertime, heavily snowing, and the airport snowplow left to clear the runway. And the plane had, been scheduled to arrive at a particular time. So the snowplow operator thought that he had about 5 minutes before the aircraft was due in. But the 737 had shortened its approach and was landing early. Of course, they didn't know that. So the aircraft saw the plow at the last minute, applied full power to take off and go around, but one of the spoilers that they'd already deployed to slow down the aircraft failed to retract. So it basically killed all the lift on one wing, and the aircraft crashed. So 6 people in the back of the plane survived, but the other 42 were killed. So it's a pretty horrific accident in Cranbrook. Meanwhile, in Edmonton, the Edmonton Municipal Airport, Industrial Airport, finally gets a new building. So the Industrial Airport is rebranded back to the Municipal, and they get a new terminal building, which is 8,000 square feet on 2 levels with a capacity for about 500 passengers per day. So we've gone from, we should probably close the Municipal to, actually, we're operating a lot of scheduled service, so let's actually build a proper terminal. If you've been to this terminal, you probably remember a lot of, it was very colorful. A lot of orange, brown, red tones, and a pretty spacious departure area. And of course, the Air Harbor Restaurant, which is a restaurant operated by John and Jean Merrick that overlooked the runway. And I used to go there for my birthdays when I was younger and basically press my face to the glass and watch the aircraft take off and land. So, the terminal building today, since of course the airport is closed, is now owned by Edmonton Public Schools. It's now a Misquitchie Academy. It's a junior high and high school that is focused on teaching Indigenous values through the Edmonton Public Schools system to Indigenous children. So if you visit the museum, we have an art display that was made by the students and teachers of Misquitchie Academy. So we're pretty happy to have them as neighbors. Some of you probably will fondly remember the Municipal Airport Terminal. It's very colorful murals, and nice hard plastic bucket seats. 1975, Northwest Airlines was operating nonstop 727 service to both Anchorage and Minneapolis, and Western Airlines was flying the 727 and 737 direct to Denver, Salt Lake City, and Great Falls, with those services stopping in Calgary first. Hughes Air West also served the airport with the Douglas DC-9, and we also had nonstop flights to Spokane, Los Angeles, and Las Vegas. So increasingly more American carriers. Max Ward wanted his carrier to grow. He was facing constant opposition from Air Canada, Canadian Pacific Airlines, and the Canadian government itself. And so every single route that he added, every single gate slot was won with a lot of effort, a lot of extremely bitter battles between Wardair, Max Ward, and the Canadian and sometimes foreign governments. And he started a real strong campaign to be allowed to operate charters within Canada, but he was constantly denied. They campaigned for fewer restrictions on charter flights, but regulations like needing to book a certain amount of time in advance, stay a certain number of fixed days, including hotels, in the charter, it really continued to stymie their growth. By the late 1970s, Wardair offered regularly scheduled charter service to a lot of countries within the UK, as I mentioned earlier. So London, Manchester, Cardiff, Newcastle, Glasgow. They also operated to the continent, so they had service to Amsterdam, Frankfurt, Paris, and Dusseldorf a few years later. In 1976, Wardair International was incorporated as the parent company to the airline, and also to International Vacations, or Intervac. At the end of the decade, they parted ways with the 747 and ordered the McDonnell Douglas DC-10, which was another jumbo jet with a range of about 9,600 kilometers for intercontinental flights. The DC-10 was an excellent aircraft, but it was kind of fraught with problems, beginning with its delivery. So strikes at McDonnell Douglas delayed the delivery in 1978, really messed up Wardair's summer charters that year quite badly. In 1979, American Airlines Flight 191 lost an engine on takeoff from Chicago's O'Hare Airport, killing everyone on board, 258 passengers and 13 crew. This and a number of other accidents really caused the public to lose a lot of confidence in the DC-10. But Wardair, Max Board knew that it was a good aircraft, and they pressed on, and they ordered additional DC-10s. And a lot of these accidents, like this American Airlines Flight 91, was caused because the ground crew at O'Hare changed one of the engines on the aircraft and improperly used a forklift to remove it, which damaged the engine mounting hardware. So as the aircraft was taking off and applying full power, the engine separated from the pylon, essentially folded back on itself over the wing. The aircraft was going too fast to stop, and so just as they took off, it rolled over and crashed. So not really any fault of the DC-10. In 1980, using the DC-10, Wardair started experimenting with a full feature and no feature model, so a $20 discount for no frill service. In 1981, they were turning a profit of about $1 million a year, carrying 1.25 million passengers. So profit, but fairly slim profit. In 1982, Pacific Western Airlines was all pumped to start operating a Vancouver to Lethbridge service, but the government stepped in and allowed only Time Air to be flying that route. So in 1983, they decided to buy Time Air. Time Air had been growing during this time. The PWA Airbus service drove Time Air to purchase larger aircraft in an attempt to compete with them. So they purchased larger and larger aircraft, culminating in the DC-7 Skydash service. They had service from Edmonton to several spots in southern Canada, Calgary, Red Deer, Lethbridge. They started service to Grand Prairie in 1979. And in 1980, they took over Northward Aviation's routes from Edmonton to Peace River and Rainbow Lake. Time Air purchased Gateway from Northward, and basically that's when they took over these routes using the Convair 640. They expanded to the de Havilland Dash 7 by selling this smaller aircraft. And as I said, PWA was constantly applying for like Calgary to Lethbridge services, Vancouver to Lethbridge routes, but they were constantly blocked because of the government not wanting carriers to compete on these routes. The PWA briefly operated a Vancouver Kelowna Lethbridge contract in 1982, but then the government stepped in and transferred that route to Time Air instead. So PWA decided, you know what, why fight it? Let's just purchase Time Air. So they purchased basically 4 of the 9 seats of the board for $4.3 million, and then basically merged Time Air into their operations. So they operated it as Time Air, and then later on, Time Air became part of Canadian Regional Airlines as Canadian Airlines and Canadian Regional Airlines were developing. 84, they acquired the Edmonton Peace River High Level and Edmonton Fort McMurray routes. Time Air did. And and it was 1985 that they started service to Grand Prairie, Dawson Creek, Prince George, and then from Prince George through the Okanagan to Williams Lake, Kamloops, Kelowna, and Penticton. So they have a pretty substantial network throughout Western Canada. These are some of the Time Air brochures from the day. So as I said, the Skydash service, branded as Skydash, they brought the de Havilland Canada Dash 7 turboprop, which could carry 50 passengers, would later be replaced by the Dash 8. And they really expanded service in the 80s and really grew their airline from, say, operating from about 5 cities to numerous cities throughout Canada, Saskatchewan, BC, and even had international service to Vancouver and Minneapolis. Throughout the 1980s, Pacific Western Airlines expanded their routes throughout Canada in partnership with other airlines and sometimes by buying them. In 1986, they joined with Time Air and Calm Air to make Pacific Western Airlines Spirit, which is a coordinated marketing attempt and essentially a precursor to Canadian regional airlines. By this time, Canadian Pacific Airlines was really struggling. In December of 1986, PWA, which was basically a smaller airline, ended up buying the much larger Canadian Pacific Airlines for $300 million. Originally, they were going to operate as 2 separate airlines, but they ended up merging them together under the Pacific Western Airlines Corporation. So PWA Corp was the overall controlling corporation, but the airline was rebranded as Canadian Airlines, with the A or the E in the chevron in Canadian. The A or the E in Canadian or Canadien were replaced by a chevron to make it bilingual. So this step essentially finally realized Russ Baker's dream of having an airline flying coast to coast with jets. This is, of course, Canadian Pacific 747. And Canadian Pacific, immediately before this, changed their orange and silver livery that they'd been using throughout the 70s and 80s to this new look. So they went from CP Air, they rebranded back to Canadian Pacific. And so when PWA Corp took over Canadian Pacific, they essentially just adopted this livery. So this became the prototype for the Canadian Airlines livery. Canadian Airlines, of course, operated until 2001, and then were acquired by Air Canada. We're going to talk about that a little bit more next month when we talk about the international and the debate. Wardair, though, was starting to become successful with their, or not starting to become, they were successful. So they put in an order for 6 Airbus A310 aircraft with the option to purchase 6 more. Airbus delivery was really badly delayed. So Wardair ended up canceling the initial order. That year, inter-airline agreements were signed in Canada. So passengers in London and Ottawa could connect with Wardair through Air Ontario connectors, and then Victoria flights could connect with the PWA agreement. This expanded then to all PWA cities in the next year. The 1982 recession was pretty serious. It hit Wardair pretty hard. They lost $13.5 million that year. Their aircraft were too big for their market, and there's too much competition. 1984, things picked up, and they posted a $2.3 million profit compared to 1.29 in 1983. For the first 3 quarters, domestic charters started, and they expanded their flights through domestic charters. So finally, they were able to fly within Canada, but they were still not able to take on actual scheduled service. And finally, they got their first scheduled routes in late 1985, with service from Toronto, Montreal to Puerto Rico, and to Manchester and London in the UK. They were still petitioning for inter-Canada scheduled service, though. And finally, that final step happened in May of 1986. They were finally given permission to operate scheduled domestic services. And that started with services linking Toronto, Calgary, Edmonton, and Vancouver with the DC-10. Following that, and with their final hurdle removed, they put in an option to purchase the Airbus A300 aircraft for the domestic service. So they put in an order for 12 Airbuses for $920 million to be delivered between November 87 and December 88. That aircraft could carry 196 passengers, so they would be phasing out the DC-10. They then announced a purchase of 8 McDonnell Douglas MD-88s in March of 88, which is a smaller 128 passenger aircraft. But they expanded way too quickly and took on an enormous amount of debt doing this, and they weren't actually able to tap into that Canadian market to the extent that they were hoping. Mainly, they weren't able to attract business customers on their scheduled services. Most of those business travelers had loyalty programs with other airliners, and were quite reluctant to transfer to Wardair, despite Wardair's great services. So, because of this huge expansion and the fact that the passenger services, the numbers just weren't there, they were faced with a really rapidly growing threat of bankruptcy. So Max Ward made pretty much the most difficult phone call of his life. He phoned up Reese Eaton, who was the president of Canadian Airlines, and reluctantly decided to sell Wardair to Canadian Airlines. So Canadian purchased Wardair, became significantly larger in the process. This picture is a transitory livery. You can see the Wardair red stripe on the aircraft and tail, and the start of the Canadian Airlines livery. Integrating the two, integrating Pacific Western Airlines and Canadian Pacific crews and employees into one airline was difficult. Integrating all the Wardair people was also difficult. There was a lot of layoffs because of redundancies. So it was definitely a difficult time for a lot of people in adapting to different company cultures. So here's the final Canadian Airlines livery in the DC-10. As I said, we're going to talk about Canadian Airlines more next month, and just kind of the services throughout the 90s, 2000s, as we cover mainly the debate between closing the municipal airport and consolidating and expanding service at the international airport. So that'll be in December, and I will see you guys all then. Have a good Christmas.